In a life filled with daily sacrifices, Lucia dedicated 9 years to caring for her husband, Ricardo, who suffered from a debilitating illness. With unwavering love, she nurtured him through every painful moment, never questioning his condition. But one fateful day, Lucia uncovered a truth that shattered her world. Ricardo, the man she had cared for so selflessly, had been deceiving her all along. His illness was a carefully crafted lie, a mask that hid his true intentions and a lifestyle of indulgence at her expense. As the veil of trust lifted, Lucia stood at the crossroads of betrayal and courage, determined to confront the man who had taken advantage of her love. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. For 9 long years, Lucia had devoted her life to caring for Ricardo, her once vibrant husband, who had been ravaged by the cruel grip of multiple sclerosis. Day after day, she poured her heart into his care, tending to his every need with the precision of a seasoned nurse. But on this particular day, something felt different. When Lucia returned home earlier than usual, she didn't expect her world to be shaken by the conversation she overheard between Ricardo and the neighbor. As she carefully adjusted the blankets around him, her hands moved with a practiced ease that had become second nature. "Are you comfortable, Ricardo? Do you need anything else?" she asked, her voice soft yet distant, echoing the routine that had consumed their lives. Ricardo shifted slowly on the sofa, where he now spent most of his days. His once strong legs had betrayed him, leaving him reliant on crutches and confined to the house. The smile he offered in return was a mere shadow of the man he used to be, and though his words were filled with gratitude, they lacked the warmth they once held. "No, Lucia, everything is fine. I don't know what I'd do without you," he muttered, his eyes drifting toward the window, avoiding hers. Lucia lingered for a moment, watching him settle into his usual spot, before turning toward the kitchen. She busied herself preparing a meal that was as nutritious as it was tasteless. Doctor's orders, of course. She was not only his wife but also his nurse, a role she had played tirelessly for nearly a decade. Her responsibilities at the hospital had followed her home, blurring the line between professional care and personal sacrifice. 9 years. 9 years of watching her husband slowly fade into someone she barely recognized. Each day, a little more of his independence slipped away, leaving behind a fragile shell of the man she once danced within their living room. The weight of it all pressed down on her as she chopped vegetables, the familiar scent of herbs mingling with the bitter taste of resignation in her mouth. Back on the sofa, Ricardo struggled to find comfort in his own body. Multiple sclerosis had taken away the ease of movement, leaving him trapped in a painful existence where even the simplest actions were a battle. He adjusted the pillow under his head and thought to himself, "Lucia does so much for me. She tries hard." But even his thoughts felt empty, like a rehearsed line in a play he no longer wanted to be part of. When Lucia returned with a plate of carefully prepared food, she set it down beside him with a gentle smile. "Here you go, dear. Try to eat a little of everything. You need to keep your strength up." Her words were laced with concern, but beneath them lay a deeper sadness, a longing for the days when care wasn't the cornerstone of their relationship. Ricardo picked up the fork reluctantly, forcing himself to eat as Lucia watched him, her eyes searching for any trace of the man she once knew. "Do you ever think about the days when we used to dance?" she asked suddenly, hoping to spark a moment of connection, however fleeting. "Do you remember how you'd spin me around the living room?" Ricardo forced a smile, his mind distant, as if the memories belonged to someone else. "Yes, I remember," he said, but the words felt hollow, the light in his eyes dimmed by the weight of all they had lost. Those were good times. Their conversations had become a delicate dance of their own, an intricate balance of necessity and nostalgia, trying to fill the gaping silence left by the illness. Lucia sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling the distance between them grow even as she physically remained by his side. "We'll keep fighting, right, Ricardo?" she whispered, more to herself than to him, as she searched the depths of her endurance for the strength to carry on. She looked at him then, his face bathed in the soft light filtering through the window, and a pang of longing twisted in her chest. She missed him, the real him, the man who once laughed with her, danced with her, loved her with all his heart. Now, she cared for a man who seemed to have lost the ability to truly care back. The irony was not lost on her. How she could pour so much love into someone who had become so emotionally distant. "Yes, Lucia, let's keep going," Ricardo replied, his voice devoid of the passion that once defined their relationship. The words flowed easily from his lips, but they carried no weight, no conviction. They were just words, empty echoes of the life they used to have. And yet, despite it all, Lucia continued. She dedicated herself to him, day in and day out, nurturing a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left for them beyond the routines of care and the surface-level conversations. She knew the illness had stolen so much from them, but deep down, a part of her refused to believe it had taken everything. The soft morning light gently filtered through the curtains, casting a warm, golden hue across the room where Ricardo had spent so many hours, seemingly trapped in his own body. Lucia, as always, woke up early, preparing herself for another demanding day at the hospital. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, every step a testament to her unwavering dedication. Before leaving, she approached Ricardo with her usual tenderness, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on his forehead. "I'm heading to work, love. There's food in the fridge, and if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call," she said, her voice filled with concern and care that only deepened with each passing day. As the door clicked shut behind Lucia, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The moment she was gone, Ricardo's face transformed from one of feigned fragility to one of cunning delight. Gone was the facade of weakness. In its place was a man brimming with deceptive energy. His eyes gleamed with mischief as he scanned the room, making sure he was alone. Confident that no one was watching, Ricardo slowly rose from the sofa, moving with an agility that belied his supposed condition. He crossed the room with purpose and made his way to a hidden safe concealed behind a painting on the wall. With practiced ease, he entered the combination and opened the door, revealing stacks of cash. Money that Lucia had painstakingly saved for medical emergencies and other unforeseen expenses. A smug grin spread across Ricardo's face as he counted the crisp bills, feeling a rush of excitement course through him. "This should do nicely for today," he thought to himself, pocketing the money with the glee of a man who had mastered the art of deceit. Every note he tucked away was a symbol of the life he was secretly leading, one far removed from the lie he lived at home. Lucia, with all her love and devotion, had no inkling of the truth. She had no idea that while she worked tirelessly to save lives, Ricardo had been living a double life, fully capable of walking all these years and squandering their savings on indulgent pleasures. With the house now empty and his pockets lined with stolen money, Ricardo left without a backward glance. He made his way to the shadowy side of the city, to a hidden underground nightclub that thrived even in the daylight hours. The club was a world of its own, a pulsating oasis of hedonism where time seemed to blur. Neon lights flashed in rhythm with the thumping bass, and the air was thick with the intoxicating scent of exotic drinks and forbidden thrills. Ricardo stepped inside with the confidence of a man who had spent far too long living in the shadows. At the bar, he ordered the most expensive drink on the menu, savoring it as if every drop were a victory over the constraints he pretended to endure at home. "Why bother living a life of lies if I can't enjoy the rewards it brings me?" he mused, watching the vibrant crowd around him. For Ricardo, these indulgences weren't just an escape. They were a twisted form of compensation for maintaining his elaborate ruse. The thrill of deception had become his lifeblood, and every sip of his drink felt like a toast to his cunning. As the hours passed, Ricardo continued to revel in his freedom, throwing money around as if it were endless. He danced without a care in the world, his laughter echoing through the club like the sound of someone who believed they had beaten the system. Every bill that left his wallet was a reminder of the power he held, the control he wielded over the truth at home. Meanwhile, Lucia was miles away, saving lives and shouldering the weight of their reality, blissfully unaware of the darkness that had taken root beside her. By the time Ricardo returned home, The day had already given way to night. He carefully resumed his position on the sofa, rehearsing the frail expression that Lucia expected to see. When the front door creaked open and she stepped inside, exhausted but fulfilled after another day of meaningful work, she looked at him with the same gentle concern as always. "How was your day, dear? Were you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine care. Ricardo, still settling into the sofa, let out a weak reply, trying to mimic the exhaustion he no longer felt. But beneath his tired facade, a flicker of irritation burned in his eyes, a reminder of the double life he led, the deceit he wove so carefully. Lucia had no way of knowing that the man she had dedicated her life to caring for was not the helpless victim of the disease she believed him to be. The darkness in their home was far more insidious than the shadows of the night. "It was a long day, love. I felt a lot of pain. Didn't move from here," Ricardo muttered, his voice feigning exhaustion. Yet, his eyes betrayed him, darting away from Lucia's as if they feared the weight of her gaze might unravel his lies. He sank further into the blankets, trying to shield himself from the possibility of discovery, but the tension in the room clung to him like a shadow. Just then, soft knocks echoed from the front door, breaking the silence and offering Lucia a momentary reprieve from the growing unease that gnawed at her. Relieved by the interruption, Lucia rose to answer the door. Standing on the threshold was Marisol, their elderly neighbor, her kind eyes crinkling into a smile as she held out a plate covered in pieces of homemade cake. "I thought you could use a little treat, Lucia. How is Ricardo doing today?" Marisol asked, her voice laced with genuine concern that made Lucia's heart ache. Forcing a smile, Lucia accepted the cake with trembling hands, the weight of Marisol's kindness pressing down on her already weary soul. "Thank you so much, Marisol," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. "Ricardo is, well, he's the same. No real improvement, but we keep fighting." The words felt hollow in her mouth, a fragile veneer of hope masking the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. From the living room, Ricardo listened intently to the exchange, his heart pounding in his chest. When Lucia returned, he blurted out, "Who was at the door?" His voice carried a sharpness that startled her, a tone that hinted at something darker than the concern of a sick man. It was the voice of someone who feared exposure, who knew that the fragile web of lies he had spun could unravel at any moment. "It was Marisol," Lucia replied calmly, though Ricardo's sudden agitation made her stomach twist with unease. "She brought us some cake." Without waiting for his response, she made her way to the kitchen, placing the cake on the table before beginning to prepare dinner. Ricardo said nothing more, retreating into the cocoon of his blankets, but the pounding of his heart betrayed his fear. Marisol had come too close to seeing him for what he truly was. Lucia moved through the kitchen on autopilot, her hands working mechanically as her mind drifted elsewhere. After finishing dinner, she served Ricardo his meal on the sofa and then returned to the kitchen. She sat at the table with a deep, weary sigh, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The exhaustion she felt was more than physical. It seeped into her bones, into her very soul. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from years of caring, of hoping, of fighting a losing battle against an illness that had stolen so much from them both. But as she sat there, staring at her hands, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. Doubt she had long suppressed, fueled by small, almost imperceptible signs she had chosen to ignore. Ricardo's condition had shown no improvement in 9 years, and yet, certain things didn't quite add up. His sudden bursts of energy, the moments when he seemed more capable than he let on. Could it be? Moved by a sudden, unsettling impulse, Lucia rose from the table and walked over to where she kept Ricardo's medication. She picked up the prescription bottle, turning it over in her hands as 1,000 questions raced through her mind. Why isn't he getting better? She wondered aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet kitchen. She scanned the names of the medications, making a mental note to look them up online later, to see if there was something she had missed, something the doctors had overlooked. Her mind buzzing with unanswered questions, Lucia turned toward the small cabinet, where they kept the emergency money. Maybe she could use it to buy some additional supplies, something that might help ease Ricardo's condition. But as she opened the drawer, a strange unease settled over her. She counted the bills, her brow furrowing in confusion as she realized that something wasn't right. The amount was smaller than it should have been, noticeably smaller. A cold chill ran down her spine, and Lucia's heart began to race. How could this be? Had she miscounted before? Had there been an expense she had forgotten about? Or was there something far more sinister at play? As Lucia opened the safe, a wave of disbelief crashed over her. The space that once held their emergency funds now stood empty. A cold, unsettling confusion gripped her heart. "This can't be right," she whispered, her hands frantically searching through the safe as if hoping the money would magically reappear. But it didn't. The reality was undeniable. The money was gone. Panic rising in her chest, Lucia called out from the kitchen, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Ricardo, have you seen the money we saved for emergencies? It's disappeared." Ricardo's response came quickly, but his tone was off, rushed, almost too eager to brush the issue aside. "I don't know, Lucia. Maybe you used it and forgot. These days have been so confusing, haven't they?" Lucia's brow furrowed as she sat at the kitchen table, her mind swirling with thoughts that wouldn't settle. The disappearance of the money was troubling enough, but even more disturbing were the nagging doubts about Ricardo's condition. 9 years of caring, and yet there had been no improvement. Her instincts as a nurse told her that something wasn't adding up. With a growing sense of unease, she picked up Ricardo's medication prescription and began studying it more closely. Something didn't feel right. Acting on impulse, Lucia opened her phone and began researching the names of the medications listed on the prescription. She expected to find information linking them to the treatment of multiple sclerosis, but what she found left her cold. The medications had nothing to do with her husband's supposed illness. They weren't even remotely related to treating his condition. Her heart began to race as confusion gave way to a deepening suspicion. "How could this be?" she murmured to herself, her thoughts racing. The shock of her discovery left her feeling unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She knew she had to confront Ricardo, but a part of her was terrified of the answers she might uncover. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Lucia awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. She prepared for her day at the hospital, but before she left, she needed to confront Ricardo. She could no longer ignore the growing inconsistencies, the nagging feeling that something was wrong. With a firm tone that masked the anxiety gnawing at her insides, Lucia approached Ricardo, who lay in bed, pretending to be trapped in the routine of forced rest. "Ricardo," she began, her voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I was looking at the prescriptions for your medications, and something isn't right. These aren't medications used to treat multiple sclerosis. Can you explain that to me?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, and Ricardo's eyes flickered with a brief flash of surprise. For a moment he hesitated, searching for the right words. "Oh, that," he stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "The doctor from my health plan, he's the one who prescribes these. There must be some mistake in your search. He told me they were the most suitable for my case, so I think we should trust him. He's one of the best doctors in the state." His voice was calm, almost too calm, but his eyes betrayed him. They wouldn't meet hers, instead darting to any point in the room that wasn't directly in front of him. Lucia wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that there was some simple explanation for all of this. But the gnawing doubt inside her refused to be silenced. Ricardo's words felt like a thin veil covering something far darker. Lucia sighed, feeling defeated for the moment. She decided to let it go, at least for now, but the unease lingered like a shadow over her heart. "All right," she said quietly. "We'll look into it later." Her words were meant to sound final, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil. She grabbed her things and headed for the door, her mind still swirling with unanswered questions. As Lucia headed off to another grueling day at the hospital, Ricardo sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. The morning's close call with Lucia had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He knew he had to be more cautious, more meticulous in his deception. The forged prescriptions had always been his safety net, but Lucia's growing suspicion was a threat he couldn't ignore. He picked up a pen, staring at the blank sheet of paper before him. "Maybe a fake doctor's signature will convince her better next time," he muttered under his breath. After a quick online search, he found the names of several well-known doctors in the region. He spent the next hour tracing their signatures, carefully imitating the loops and flourishes of each one. Every stroke of the pen was a calculated effort to stay ahead of Lucia's questioning gaze, to preserve the lie he had been living for so long. Later that day, with the forged prescriptions safely tucked away, Ricardo slipped into his clothes and prepared to enjoy another afternoon of freedom. The thrill of his double life still coursed through him as he walked out the door, unaware that his neighbor, Marisol, was watching from her window. Marisol, the sweet elderly woman who had brought them cake just the day before, couldn't believe her eyes. There was Ricardo, walking down the street with ease, without so much as a limp. Her eyes widened, and she instinctively gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "But what's going on?" she murmured, squinting as if to double-check that what she was seeing was real. The image of Ricardo, whom she had believed to be debilitated and dependent on Lucia's care, clashed violently with the sight of him striding confidently away. The unsettling revelation left Marisol reeling, but she wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Still, the image of Ricardo moving so freely stayed with her, nagging at her like a persistent itch she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Lucia tried to focus on her work at the hospital, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the unsettling conversation she'd had with Ricardo that morning. No matter how much she researched, the medication on his prescription didn't seem to have any connection to multiple sclerosis. Her mind was awash with doubts and possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Is the doctor mistaken? Or is Ricardo lying to me? The very thought of it sent a shiver down her spine. Could the man she had cared for so lovingly for 9 years be deceiving her? During her break, Lucia sought out Dr. Navarro, a trusted colleague and friend. If anyone could help her make sense of this mess, it was him. She explained everything. Her concerns about the medication, the strange discrepancies, and her deepening sense of unease. Navarro listened carefully, his brow furrowing with concern. "Lucia, if this medication has no relation to Ricardo's illness, then something is wrong. Either his doctor is gravely mistaken, or someone isn't telling you the truth," he said gently, but his words hit Lucia like a blow. The notion that Ricardo could be lying to her seemed absurd, almost impossible to believe. She had known him for so long and cared for him with all the love in her heart. How could he possibly be involved in something so sinister? "No, Navarro, there must be some kind of mistake," she replied, shaking her head in disbelief. "Ricardo wouldn't do that. Maybe the doctor is misinformed. I'll try to find out more about him before jumping to conclusions." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her insides. Could it be that simple? Or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface of their lives? After enduring hours of intense and solitary reflection, Marisol finally reached a crucial turning point in her resolve. "I cannot stand idly by any longer," she affirmed with a fiery determination that had been dormant within her for far too long. This was not a decision made lightly. It was born from a wellspring of inner strength and an urgent need to confront a situation that had been gnawing at her conscience. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Ricardo ambled back home. He painstakingly retrieved his crutches from their resting place outside the house and made his way toward the door, striving to project an air of normalcy and avoid arousing any suspicion. Unbeknownst to Ricardo, Marisol was already stationed at her post, standing on her porch with an air of unwavering resolve. Her presence was a beacon of defiance, radiating a potent mixture of indignation and determination. Ricardo's surprise was palpable as he encountered Marisol in such an assertive stance. He fought to maintain his composure, though the shock of her confrontation was evident in his eyes. "Marisol, is there something you need from me?" he asked, his voice a precarious blend of cautious politeness and feigned innocence. Marisol's gaze was intense, a storm of emotions swirling behind her eyes as she locked onto him. I saw you earlier today, Ricardo. You moved about as though nothing was wrong. Does Lucia know about this? She challenged, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, each word imbued with a mix of accusation and urgency. The facade of Ricardo's calm demeanor began to crack under the pressure of her scrutiny. His mind raced, scrambling to devise a plan to extricate himself from this precarious situation. Marisol, you must be mistaken. You know how limited my mobility is. I can barely move. He hastened to reply, his voice betraying the strain of his deceit. Sensing that Marisol's resolve was unshakable, his tone shifted, taking on a menacing edge. If you truly believe you witnessed something, it would be prudent for you to keep that information to yourself. Delving into matters that don't concern you can be dangerous, he warned, his voice laden with a veiled threat that seeped into the atmosphere. Marisol stepped back slightly, her heart pounding with a blend of fear and steadfast resolve. But her determination remained resolute. I just need to understand, she murmured, more to herself than to him, as Ricardo brushed past her and retreated into his house, leaving her alone with her swirling doubts and deep-seated fears. Ricardo, acutely aware of the flicker of uncertainty in Marisol's eyes, knew he had to tighten his grip on the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. With a calculated and chilling calm, he closed the distance between them, his face set in a stern expression that betrayed his unwavering intent to preserve his deceit. Marisol, you may think you've seen something, but I assure you, you are gravely mistaken. Could be a trick of the light, a distortion of shadows, or perhaps even an issue with your eyesight. People of your age often experience such confusion, he asserted, attempting to undermine her perception with a patronizing tone. Despite the shock that rippled through her, Marisol's defiant gaze did not waver. Ricardo continued, his voice now thick with an ominous threat. And let's entertain the possibility that you report this to Lucia. Do you believe she will take your side? The neighbor who suddenly claims to see bizarre things? Or will she believe me, the ailing husband she cares for tirelessly day and night? He paused deliberately, allowing the gravity of his words to settle heavily in the air. Marisol, you need to think very carefully about this. Such accusations could easily lead to questions about one's sanity. Imagine the shame and isolation if the entire community started to perceive you as unstable. The thought of being branded as a lunatic was a cold, piercing blade cutting through Marisol's resolve. She began to retreat, her once unshakable confidence eroding under the weight of the implied threat and the fear of being discredited and alienated by the community she deeply valued. I only want what's best for Lucia, she whispered, her voice quivering with a mixture of desperation and self-justification, as if trying to convince herself of her righteousness. It was at that moment, as if the universe had timed it with cruel precision, that Lucia arrived, her presence injecting a new layer of complexity and tension into the already charged atmosphere. Lucia arrived to find Ricardo and Marisol standing together, a palpable tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. What's happening here? Lucia inquired, her voice laced with concern as she shifted her gaze between the two, an unsettling knot forming in her stomach. Ricardo, ever the opportunist, sprang into action with a hastily concocted explanation. Lucia, we were just having a little chat about recipes. Marisol was kindly suggesting some dietary options that might help with my condition. I've been trying to move around more to get used to these crutches, though I must admit, I still find them rather bothersome, he said with an exaggerated grin, his eyes casting a pointed look at Marisol. The glance was unmistakable, a warning to her about the repercussions of challenging his fabricated story. Marisol, feeling the oppressive weight of Ricardo's stare, hesitated momentarily. Her resolve wavered, and she offered a weak nod. Yes, that's right. I just wanted to help, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she deliberately avoided meeting Lucia's eyes. Despite her lingering doubts, Lucia chose not to delve deeper, attributing the strange atmosphere to Marisol's concern for Ricardo's well-being. The conversation soon turned to trivial matters, with Ricardo maintaining a veneer of cordiality. After a brief and strained exchange, Marisol took her leave, her eagerness to escape the charged environment palpable. As Marisol walked back home, her thoughts swirled in her mind like autumn leaves caught in a turbulent wind. How can I reveal the truth to Lucia without risking my credibility? How can I protect my friend when my testimony might be doubted? She pondered, feeling the sting of frustration. Despite her well-intentioned efforts, the challenge of exposing the truth seemed more daunting with each passing moment. Entering her home, Marisol felt a wave of defeat washed over her. Yet she was not entirely disheartened. She knew she needed a strategic approach, perhaps gathering concrete evidence or finding a way to force Ricardo into a corner where his lies would be exposed. "I'll find a way," she vowed to herself, her resolve strengthening. The struggle to safeguard Lucia was just beginning, and Marisol was prepared to see it through to the end, no matter the obstacles. Meanwhile, Ricardo reclined on the couch, his usual demeanor of feigned frailty now replaced by a troubled and introspective expression. The mere thought of Marisol divulging what she had witnessed plagued him with anxiety. He understood that the exposure of his deceit could lead not only to the loss of Lucia's support and sympathy, but also to potential social and legal repercussions. "I need to ensure Marisol remains silent," he thought, meticulously calculating his next moves with the precision of a seasoned chess player. Beyond his immediate concern about Marisol, Ricardo reflected on the broader motivations driving his elaborate ruse. From the outset, his ambition had been to enjoy a life of ease and luxury, free from the burdens of work and the demands of daily responsibilities. Manipulating Lucia into becoming his caregiver and financial provider was a crucial component of his grand scheme. As Lucia entered the room, Ricardo swiftly shifted his focus from strategic planning to maintaining his carefully crafted persona. Lucia, her face marked by an unusual seriousness, approached him with a direct and probing question. "Ricardo, could you show me the prescription for these new medications and provide more information about the doctor overseeing your treatment?" she asked, a hint of suspicion coloring her voice. Ricardo, without missing a beat, retrieved one of the recently forged prescriptions from the coffee table, where he had deliberately left it for Lucia to find. The prescription was meticulously forged, bearing a signature that Ricardo had practiced until it was flawless. He handed the document to Lucia with a facade of confidence. "Here it is, my love. This is the new doctor the health plan recommended. He seems very competent," Ricardo said, his voice warm as he presented the prescription. Lucia scrutinized the document, her brow furrowing in thought. "And what's his name? Could we perhaps visit him together next time?" she asked, hoping for details that might clear the cloud of uncertainty gathering over her. Ricardo felt a pang of anxiety twist in his stomach but managed to maintain his outward calm. "Oh, he's quite busy with numerous commitments, and he prefers not to entertain unnecessary visits. However, if you'd like, I can certainly ask him to make time for you on our next appointment," Ricardo replied, skillfully dodging specifics that could unravel his carefully constructed deceit. Lucia, though not entirely convinced, decided to pursue this thread further at a later time. As soon as Lucia retreated to another room, she picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number Ricardo had provided. Her heart raced with the anxiety of possibly unearthing a truth she wasn't prepared to face. The phone rang several times before a polished, formal voice answered on the other end. "Hello, Dr. Mendez's office. Good evening. How may I assist you?" "Hello? I'd like to speak with Dr. Mendez regarding a patient named Ricardo Meneses. He's my husband, and he's been receiving prescriptions for a serious condition," Lucia said, striving to keep her voice steady despite her mounting apprehension. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have no record of a patient by that name. Are you certain you've dialed the correct number?" The secretary replied, her voice tinged with confusion. Lucia's heart sank as the reality of Ricardo's deception began to crystallize. She hung up the phone, feeling the weight of her suspicions solidify into undeniable truth. Ricardo was lying, but to what end? How deep did his deceit go? The next morning, The calm and sunny Saturday dawned in stark contrast to the brewing storm at Lucia and Ricardo's home. Marisol, holding a freshly baked cake and driven by a resolve to uncover the truth, approached their front door with a determined stride. She was ready to confront Ricardo directly, even if it meant unveiling uncomfortable truths. When Ricardo answered the door, his surprise and unease were palpable. He had donned his crutches to continue his charade, but Marisol's early appearance unsettled him. "Marisol, if you've come to stir up trouble or question my wife, I suggest you leave," he said. His voice edged with barely concealed anxiety, though he tried to mask it with a veneer of politeness. Marisol, observing Ricardo's discomfiture, couldn't suppress a knowing smile. "Oh, Ricardo, I simply thought I'd brighten your Saturday with this cake I baked. I hoped we could enjoy it together as good neighbors," she said, her voice dripping with subtle irony, though her eyes sparkled with determination. At that moment, Lucia appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of Marisol. "How delightful to see you here. Please come in. Let's have breakfast together. Your visit is a wonderful surprise," Lucia exclaimed with genuine warmth. With a reluctant sigh, Ricardo stepped aside to let Marisol enter, his crutches clacking softly as he followed behind. Once inside, they gathered around the kitchen table, where Lucia served coffee and sliced the cake Marisol had brought. The sweet scent of the cake mingled with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, creating a cozy, inviting atmosphere that sharply contrasted with the underlying tension. As they conversed, Marisol subtly wove in comments that, to Lucia's discerning ear, seemed to carry hidden implications. Each remark, layered with a delicate balance of casualness and intent, added to the growing complexity of the situation. "You know, Lucia," Marisol said, her voice tinged with a bittersweet edge, "there's something special about seeing people for who they truly are. Sometimes, the truth is far more satisfying than any cake I could bake." Her gaze lingered meaningfully on Ricardo, who struggled to mask his unease, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. Lucia, sensing an undercurrent of tension, excused herself under the pretext of needing the bathroom. However, instead of heading there, she subtly maneuvered into a position where she could overhear the conversation in the kitchen without being noticed. It was then that she caught Ricardo's whispered threat to Marisol. "You should be careful with your words, Marisol. It wouldn't be wise to meddle where you're not welcome. It would be a real shame if something were to happen because of your accusations." Ricardo's voice carried a dangerous edge. When Lucia returned to the kitchen, she maintained a facade of normalcy, her face a mask of neutrality. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, though the weight of Ricardo's threat hung heavily in the air. As Marisol prepared to leave, Lucia walked her to the door, exchanging a brief, telling glance with Ricardo, who stayed behind in the house. The moment Marisol stepped outside, the floodgates of her emotions opened. She allowed her tears to flow freely, her composure shattered by the intensity of the day. Lucia, her heart aching for her friend, gently asked what was wrong. Marisol, with a trembling sigh and tear-streaked face, finally revealed the harrowing truth. "Lucia, I don't know how to say this, but Ricardo isn't sick. I saw him walking around just fine when you weren't there. He's been deceiving you." Lucia stood in stunned silence as Marisol laid bare the entire story. Ricardo's menacing threats, his suspiciously good health, and his deceptive behavior. Marisol's revelation, though deeply upsetting, began to connect the fragmented doubts Lucia had harbored. As the realization sank in, tears of betrayal and sadness streamed down Lucia's face. She embraced Marisol, overwhelmed with gratitude for her friend's bravery in unveiling such a painful truth. The confrontation that followed was charged with palpable tension. Lucia faced Ricardo in the living room, her heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. She knew she needed time and space to digest everything and decide on her next steps. "Ricardo, I have to step out to handle some urgent matters," she said, striving to maintain a firm tone despite the inner turmoil roiling within her. Ricardo, noticing the growing suspicion in Lucia's eyes, felt a surge of panic. "Do you need to go now? Can't it wait? Seems like you're always out lately," I don't feel comfortable with you being out alone, especially at night, he said, his voice laced with frustration and a hint of desperation. Lucia, her resolve hardened by the day's revelations and her mounting suspicions, responded with an unexpected firmness. Yes, Ricardo, I'm going out, and it's something that can't be postponed. It's important. Her decision was unequivocal, leaving no room for negotiation. Ricardo, realizing that pushing further could escalate the situation, reluctantly acquiesced. Yet, his mind raced with frantic calculations, devising strategies to mitigate the fallout of Lucia's newfound independence and the unraveling of his deceit. As Lucia drove away from the cafe, her mind swirled with confusion and urgency. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her, and she knew she needed an objective perspective. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Dr. Navarro's number. "Navarro, can we meet now? I need to discuss something very personal," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. They agreed to meet at a small, secluded cafe, shielded from any prying eyes. Lucia arrived first, her anxiety palpable as she waited for Navarro. When he arrived, Lucia wasted no time, launching into the full account of her ordeal. She recounted the discrepancies in Ricardo's medical prescriptions, Marisol's distressing revelation, and Ricardo's ominous threats. Navarro listened with growing concern, his demeanor reflecting his increasing seriousness. "Lucia, this situation is indeed very serious," Navarro said, his voice laden with gravity. "If Ricardo is indeed fabricating his illness, this is not just a betrayal of your trust. It's an egregious misuse of your compassion and professionalism." His eyes met Lucia's, conveying a mix of indignation and concern. Back at home, Ricardo's anxiety simmered as he paced the room. The threat of Lucia uncovering his deceit loomed over him, and the thought of fleeing crossed his mind. But deep down, he resisted the urge to run. "I need to find a way to turn this around," he muttered, his mind racing to devise a strategy that would not only salvage his current situation but also strengthen his foothold in Lucia's life. Taking a deep breath, Ricardo resolved to confront the crisis head-on. He knew that to maintain his facade and regain Lucia's trust, he needed a plan that was both elaborate and convincing. With renewed determination, he began to strategize, focusing on how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He turned his attention to the closet in their shared room, a place where he had hidden his secret stash of medications. As he rummaged through the drawers, he found a metal box, carefully concealed. Inside were bottles of pills, medications he had pretended to take for years. They were still sealed, a testament to the elaborate deception he had crafted. With a sense of resolve, Ricardo took the bottles, ready to integrate them into his new plan. Later that evening, as Ricardo lay on the couch in his recovery pose, Lucia returned home. She observed him with a scrutinizing gaze as he pretended to follow his prescribed routine. Ricardo, meticulously performing his role, took his medication with a practiced casualness. However, Lucia's attention was sharp, and she noted with concern that Ricardo took several more pills than necessary. "Ricardo," Lucia said, her voice laced with a touch of feigned concern, "you really shouldn't exceed your medication. Can be quite dangerous." She watched closely, trying to gauge whether Ricardo's actions were part of his carefully crafted charade or a sign of genuine ignorance. Ricardo, unaware of Lucia's growing suspicion, continued with his act, trying to maintain the illusion of his illness. As he swallowed the extra pills, he hoped that his performance would reassure Lucia and help him regain her trust. But internally, he was grappling with the pressure of sustaining his deception while preparing for any potential fallout from the unraveling truth. Lucia's heart raced as she covertly followed Ricardo, her emotions a tangled mess of disbelief and anguish. The realization of his deception was a blow she wasn't fully prepared for, yet there was no mistaking the evidence before her eyes. As she watched him enter the local bar with a casual ease that contradicted his supposed affliction, her anger and sadness grew with each passing second. She snapped photos, each click of the camera a stark reminder of the betrayal that had silently poisoned their relationship. The images she captured spoke volumes. Ricardo's confident strides, the casual way he interacted with the bar staff, and the complete absence of any sign of the struggle he had feigned at home. Lucia felt her world tilting, struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the deceitful figure she now observed. Once she was certain she had gathered enough evidence, Lucia could no longer remain in the vicinity. Her heart was too heavy, her mind too clouded with the pain of betrayal. She walked away from the bar, her tears flowing unchecked, a reflection of the turmoil raging within her. She wandered through the streets, aimlessly at first, trying to make sense of the day's revelations. The vibrant morning, once promising a fresh start, now felt like a cruel backdrop to her emotional upheaval. Eventually, Lucia found herself in a quiet park, a place where she could sit undisturbed and collect her thoughts. The tranquil surroundings offered a temporary respite from her inner storm, allowing her to process the depth of her disappointment and grief. The images she had taken burned in her mind, a painful reminder of the false reality Ricardo had constructed. As she sat on a bench, her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Navarro, checking in to see if she was okay. Lucia responded briefly, acknowledging the evidence she had found and her emotional state. Navarro's reply was supportive, urging her to take care of herself and offering to meet again to discuss the next steps. With a resolve born from her sorrow and newfound clarity, Lucia decided she needed to confront Ricardo with the undeniable proof she had collected. She knew that a face-to-face confrontation would be essential, but she also understood that it required careful planning to ensure she could address the situation fully and justly. With a heavy heart but a clear purpose, Lucia made her way back home. The drive was somber, filled with reflections on the life she had shared with Ricardo and the painful truth she was about to reveal. She felt a mix of dread and determination, knowing that the confrontation would be a pivotal moment in their lives. Upon arriving home, Lucia took a deep breath and steeled herself for the confrontation. She knew that facing Ricardo with the evidence would be a challenging ordeal, but she was committed to confronting the truth and seeking a resolution. She entered the house, her heart pounding as she prepared to address the deception that had shadowed their life together. Lucia's resolve hardened as she watched Ricardo's actions, the sight of him taking excessive amounts of medication only cementing her need for confrontation. She approached him, her face a mask of calm determination despite the storm of emotions roiling inside her. "Ricardo, we need to talk," Lucia said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of firmness. Ricardo, startled by her sudden seriousness, glanced up from the medication bottle with a puzzled look. "What's this about now?" he asked, his casual tone failing to mask the underlying anxiety. Lucia took a deep breath, knowing she had to be direct and assertive. "I've seen something today that can't be ignored. I have proof, Ricardo. Proof that you've been lying to me about your condition." Ricardo's face paled slightly, his eyes darting to the bottle in his hand as he tried to gauge how much Lucia had uncovered. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, attempting to feign ignorance. Lucia didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone and displayed the photos she had taken of him walking normally and entering the bar. "Here's what I saw today. You were walking without crutches and going to a bar like someone who's perfectly healthy. How do you explain this?" Ricardo's initial reaction was a mix of anger and panic. He had hoped to manipulate the situation further, but now, confronted with undeniable evidence, he struggled to maintain his composure. "Lucia, it's not what it looks like. No, Ricardo." Lucia cut him off, her voice rising with a mixture of hurt and anger. "I've seen enough. The truth is out. I trusted you, and you betrayed that trust with lies and deceit. How could you do this to me?" Ricardo's mind raced, trying to come up with a plausible excuse, but the reality of Lucia's confrontation left him disoriented. He realized that his attempts to manipulate the situation had ultimately led to his downfall. "Lucia, please let me explain. I didn't mean to hurt you." Lucia shook her head, tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. "No more explanations, Ricardo. I need to understand why you did this and what you plan to do now. But first, I need to take time for myself to process all of this. I'm not sure what the next step is, but I can't continue living in this lie." Ricardo, seeing that he had lost control of the situation, tried one last desperate plea. "Lucia, please don't leave like this. Let's work through this together. I can explain everything. Just give me a chance." But Lucia, already overwhelmed by the weight of the betrayal, made her decision. "I need space, Ricardo. We'll talk later. But right now, I need to be alone to figure out what's best for both of us." With that, Lucia turned and walked out of the room, her heart heavy with the pain of the revelation and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As she left the house, she knew that confronting Ricardo was just the beginning of a longer journey toward healing and understanding the truth of their relationship. Lucia remained steadfast as Ricardo's anger erupted. The sound of his shouting filled the room, but she stood her ground, her resolve unwavering despite the chaos unfolding around her. "Ricardo, this isn't about everything you've done for us. It's about the lies you've spun and the deceit you've used to manipulate me," Lucia said calmly, though her voice was edged with a mixture of hurt and determination. "You've betrayed our trust and committed fraud. This isn't just a personal betrayal. It's a legal and ethical breach." Ricardo's rage escalated as he paced frenetically. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect us. I needed time to fix things. You're ruining everything." Lucia shook her head, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. "No, Ricardo, you've created this mess, and now you need to face the consequences of your actions. I trusted you, and you've abused that trust in ways I can't overlook. You forged documents, faked illness. How could I just ignore that?" Ricardo's desperation reached a peak, his face flushed and eyes wild. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to handle things. I thought if I could just keep up the act, everything would work out." "Ricardo, it's too late for apologies," Lucia said firmly. "The evidence is already with Dr. Navarro and the court. There's no going back from this." As Lucia finished speaking, Ricardo's anger turned to despair. He slumped into a chair, his earlier bravado evaporating into a sobering realization of the gravity of his situation. The realization that he could face severe legal consequences and the potential loss of everything he had built, including Lucia's trust and their relationship, began to sink in. Lucia, recognizing that further confrontation would only add to the turmoil, took a deep breath and turned to leave. "I need to go now, Ricardo. I need to find some clarity and make decisions about what comes next." As she walked out of the house, Lucia felt a weight lift from her shoulders, even as the pain of the betrayal lingered. The truth, painful as it was, had been exposed, and she was beginning the hard process of facing the consequences and planning her next steps. Outside, Lucia paused for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the reality of what had happened. The crisp air and the quiet of the evening were a stark contrast to the emotional storm she had just navigated. With renewed determination, she resolved to focus on her healing and to move forward with the strength and clarity she had found through this challenging ordeal. Thank you for joining us in this gripping journey through betrayal, deception, and the pursuit of truth. Lucia's story highlights the profound impact that trust and honesty have in our relationships and the serious consequences that can arise from deceit. So, what have you learned from Lucia's experience? How can we apply these lessons to our own lives? Reflect on one key takeaway from this story and share it with us in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, please leave your comments, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more engaging content. Your support helps us continue bringing valuable stories and lessons to you. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.